Welcome, everyone. I'll give it a moment or two for folks to join and then get us started. Welcome again, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar tonight. My name is Sarah Boivin. I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and I will be helping to facilitate this meeting. We're here this evening to learn more about Canada's IHRA handbook and why this document is dangerous to our work organizing for Palestinian liberation and an end to Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and Israel's outward spiraling attacks against Iran. I'm a member of the Montreal chapter and calling in from the city, known as Tiohtià:ke in the Mohawk language of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation on whose territory it sits, a place known, lived in, and traveled through by many other nations, including the Anishinaabe, who know it as Muniang. We ground our work in solidarity with Palestinians in the reality that we are working on occupied and stolen Indigenous territory here, and we stand with the Indigenous nations continuing to fight our colonial governments for sovereignty and self-determination of their lives, lands, and waters. As our governments provide the arms, funding, and justification for Israeli violence and land theft at the international scale, they are dismissing and minimizing Indigenous authority over their own territories here with bills in the so-called national interest. We know that this colonial violence in domestic and international policy starts in small ways that normalize and propel these views forward. The IHRA definition is one of those many racist colonial tools. And as a member of IJV, I want to express my gratitude for the tremendous work that so many across and outside of our organization continue to take on to challenge its adoption. Thank you to our staff for organizing and our speakers for sharing your experience and expertise with us tonight. So, what is IHRA? IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, who in 2016 adopted their working definition of anti-Semitism. IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism is the preferred definition of Israel and the Zionist movement because its vague language easily conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Two key parts of the IHRA definition are the definition itself and the examples. The definition is beyond opaque, stating that anti-Semitism, quote, is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. The examples include statements such as, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, end quote, which its proponents argue is just another way of saying anti-Zionism. IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism is functionally useless, and its examples give legitimacy to racist, anti-Palestinian ideas like Nakba denial, denial of apartheid, and the accusation that Palestinians and all who oppose Zionism are anti-Semitic. IJV has a lot of resources on understanding IHRA and why it is unfit for fighting anti-Semitism, which you can look over after this call using the link in the chat. I'll put that in the chat in a moment. Tonight we are focusing specifically, thank you, Izzo. Tonight we're focusing specifically on the Canadian IHRA handbook. In 2019, Canada adopted the IHRA working definition as part of its anti-racism strategy. Then in 2022, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau committed to producing a handbook for its implementation. Last year, in 2024, the handbook was published by the Office of Deborah Lyons, Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. Lyons, who is not Jewish, has self-identified as a Zionist and has a long track record of misidentifying support for Palestinian human rights as anti-Semitic. The Canadian IHRA handbook promotes the adoption of IHRA across Canadian society, from universities to law enforcement and judges to nonprofits and civil society groups. Tonight, we'll hear more from an incredible group of speakers about what is in the handbook, why it's dangerous, and how to fight back when IHRA is being promoted. Tonight, we'll hear from Corey Balsam from IJV, Palestinian activist Dalia El Farah, Joshua Seeley Harrington of Windsor Law School, and Amaya Gelman from the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I will be providing more detailed bios ahead of each speaker. We don't have time for a Q&A tonight, but if you leave this webinar with any questions, you can send an email to info@ijvcanada.org for follow-up. If you have any trouble with Zoom, you can send a direct message to the hosts using the chat function, and the webinar will also be recorded and available to watch after the event. So with that, I am delighted to turn first to IJV's own Corey Balsam. Corey is a founding member of Independent Jewish Voices and has served as our national coordinator since 2017. He is a co-author of IJV's publication, which is the subject of this webinar, Silenced in Our Name, a Jewish Commentary on Canada's IHRA Handbook. Before joining IJV, Corey spent nearly 4 years living and working in Palestine with Oxfam. He holds a master's in sociology and equity studies in education from the University of Toronto and a bachelor's in public affairs and policy management from Carleton University, both focused on matters related to Palestine and Zionism. Corey, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that intro, and a big thanks to all the speakers, Dalia, Joshua, and Amaya, for agreeing to participate and join us today. And so glad that everyone here could join us. Do we have there we go. Yeah. Okay, so this commentary resource, which we're launching today, is a product of IJV's No IHRA campaign committee, which includes members of IJV across the country, several of whom contributed to this publication. So a big thanks to them as well. That campaign committee launched in 2019 and has been working on pushing back against the onslaught of the IHRA definition, along with various allies across the country ever since. To learn more about that campaign, again, I encourage you to go to our website, noihra.ca, which is already in the chat. And our website, you'll find this publication that we just launched, as well as previous reports, including one really going deep into the definition, analyzing the definition itself, another on the suppression of Palestine solidarity and speech on Palestine in Canada, as well as a long list of institutions and organizations that have taken no IHRA stances. So basically, since IHRA published its working definition in 2016, pro-Israel lobby groups, especially CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which is the largest and most influential pro-Israel lobby group in Canada, have been pushing for IHRA's adoption across Canada at all levels, federal, provincial, and municipal. As you can see from this quote from 2019, CIJA's intention with IHRA has been crystal clear from the get-go: to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And at least as it relates to IHRA's adoptions, I mean, we've had definitely some success at institutional levels, unions, and et cetera. Some municipalities, they've had more success, unfortunately. The Canadian government has adopted it. 8 provinces have either adopted or endorsed it, and nearly 20 municipalities have also supported it. With IHRA now widely adopted by the government, we're now seeing these same groups, CIJA, Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, B'nai B'rith, push for it to be applied now or implemented in different ways. Of course, this was always sold as a non-binding definition, but now the push is really to implement and act upon it. And they're able to do that with the help of Deborah Lyons, who's the Canadian Special Envoy on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism. She's also an envoy to IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as an institution. So the biggest step thus far, I think, in this direction in this direction of applying the definition in law and policy came when in January 2022, as Sarah mentioned, Justin Trudeau announced a handbook on IHRA would be prepared to, quote, support the adoption, understanding, and practical use of the definition across Canada. And then yeah, so prior to being published, the document was apparently reviewed by 150 stakeholders. It was also apparently vetted by the Prime Minister's office and consulted on with 9 different departments, including the legal units of Canadian Heritage, the RCMP, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and the Treasury Board. We've just learned this from an access to information request. And yet, despite all that reviewing, or maybe in some cases because of it, the handbook turned out, as expected, to be largely geared toward silencing criticism of Israel rather than fighting genuine anti-Semitism. Our commentary serves to break it down section by section, highlighting and responding to what we felt were the most egregious elements of the handbook. Specifically, the commentary breaks down 3 key sections of the handbook. The first, its introduction, in which it offers so-called information about who Jews and Canadian Jews are and what anti-Semitism has looked like historically. The section, number 2, the section in which it offers Canadian case studies associated with IHRA's 11 so-called illustrative examples, and the section in which it lays out suggestions for how IHRA might be implemented across a range of sectors that cover Canadian society. So I don't have too much time today, but I just want to give you a sense of a few examples, a few examples in each of those categories. So in that first introduction section, there's quite a lot in there. Just highlighting a few key passages. This one we found to be rather curious. How this one passed the vetters is beyond me, but it suggests that Jews in Canada currently face, quote, unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in 2024. To be clear, anti-Semitism is alive and well, and it's fueled, no doubt, today by Israel's genocidal campaign on Palestinians and others in the region. But to suggest that Jews in Canada are today facing more anti-Semitism than they were, for example, in the early part of the 20th century when my grandparents moved to this country is simply a fabrication. And it contributes to maintaining a state of fear and hypervigilance amongst Jews that is all too often channeled in the direction of support for Israel Zionism and over-policing. In this passage, the handbook cautions against token Jews who challenge the IHRA definition, and in doing so, apparently contribute to and empower anti-Semitism. I always thought the other way around, but anyways. In doing so, the handbook aims to delegitimize voices of Jews like ours, of course, by implying that a real Jew must support Israel. To be clear, this is the Canadian government defining Jewishness as Zionist, a leap that is itself a form of anti-Semitism. Moving to the next section, where we unpack some of the most egregious Canadian-made manifestations of IHRA's illustrative examples. This gem is arguably the clearest case of the handbook conflating legitimate criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. The fact that this post was included as an example of anti-Semitism at the same time as Israel actually carries out a genocide and ethnic cleansing makes it all the more absurd and egregious. Jumping now to the practical application section. We aim here to briefly unpack the government's recommendations, pointing to the various ways in which they can be weaponized against Palestinians and their supporters. As this section makes clear, Canada's IHRA handbook is fundamentally a tool for the government and lobby groups to push IHRA's implementation across Canadian society, in law enforcement, the legal system, educational institutions, government programming, workplaces, and civil society. So just to give you a sense here, and again, there's much more in our commentary itself. But this section on the legal system may just be the most contradictory given the so-called non-binding nature of the definition and the handbook. It recommends, amongst other things, using IHRA to train judges, draft jurisprudence, and interpret hate crime legislation. And I'm sure Joshua will enlighten us more about the legal contradictions of this document. Here on education, again, there's a lot in here in our commentary, but just briefly, it goes into, of course, how IHRA can be integrated into education at different levels. And this is not just post-secondary, but also we can assume secondary or even younger. It recommends that IHRA be used to educate students about anti-Semitism from a young age, be incorporated into EDI policies, and used as the metric by which to assess accusations of anti-Semitism on campuses. And this is, of course, in the wake of the massive encampment movement. So just to wrap up, as our commentary should make clear, the handbook is a danger for all Canadians and needs to be done away with. It fuels anti-Palestinian racism by suggesting that opposing Zionism, the basis for Palestinian oppression, including the current genocide, is anti-Semitic. It fuels anti-Semitism itself by equating Jews in a genocidal apartheid state. It impedes freedom of expression and the right to protest human rights abuses by unfairly limiting political speech. It puts people's jobs, careers, and reputations at risk. And in doing all this, and this is probably the most egregious, it inhibits action by the Canadian public and government at a time when action has never been more needed. So right now, the most important work we can do is to resist the ongoing Israeli genocide in Palestine, including by pushing an arms embargo and other sanctions against Israel. That being said, it's important that we continue to challenge the IHRA definition and this handbook. So I urge everyone watching or that might watch this later on YouTube to share this commentary far and wide, including with those in your institutions, to encourage those same institutions or organizations you belong to take a public stand against IHRA, and you'd be in very good company. There are many that have done so. And to ensure that when fighting anti-Semitism, it's done as part of a broader anti-racist, anti-oppression framework, which, of course, must include anti-Palestinian racism. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Corey, for the walkthrough, and big thanks again to the committee who worked on this and all of the work that went into breaking down the dangers in this handbook. I see a couple raised hands. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're not going to have time for a Q&A today. We are lucky to have 4 wonderful speakers with us, so I'm going to move to our next speaker, but folks are welcome to send me a message in the chat if you want to throw something in, and also to email info@ijvcanada.org that we can drop in the chat again if you have questions following this session. So now I am really delighted to introduce Dalia El Fada. Dalia is a Palestinian activist on Turtle Island with a background in DEDI, community engagement, relationship building, and communications. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Corey, for sharing that. I'm very grateful to be here today, and for everyone sharing their expertise and knowledge. And so I did intentionally ask Sarah to minimize my introduction because I did want to share a part of my story as my introduction. And I know we're tight on time, so I will try to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm a Palestinian from Gaza. My father's family is from the city of Khan Yunis. My children's paternal family is originally from Bir Saba, and they are now in Jabalia. So needless to say, the past 20 months have been a nightmare for us. We've lost over 300 family members to death. Many more have been injured and displaced, and are slowly being starved by the occupation. So it has been very challenging for us to show up, but I am someone who's committed to justice, and I'm here to present a Palestinian perspective on the IHRA Handbook and how it perpetuates anti-Palestinian racism and who it most directly harms, Palestinians. And also, like Corey mentioned, it does hurt the Jewish community as well. But I do want to start by giving a brief part of my story is my own relationship to Judaism. So I didn't grow up in Palestine. I grew up in the Arab diaspora. And we would visit Palestine, we'd visit Gaza every summer, and we'd do the border crossing from Jordan. This was before the siege, it was still possible to do that. But a journey that would take normally or should have taken 2 to 3 hours would sometimes be 12 to 20 hours. And the crossing itself and the border processes themselves was very challenging because there was a lot of humiliation by the soldiers, and as a child, being interrogated, being strip searched, being yelled at, and that was the normal. That was what we came to expect. And the first thing that, after the hours and hours of grueling emotional and physical challenges, I would exit the building. We'd exit the building, and the first thing we saw was a little hill with an installation, almost like an art installation of the Star of David. And to me, that became synonymous. That to me became synonymous with the fear, with the occupation, with all the treatment I was being exposed to. And so in my head, as a child and a teenager, my experience of Jewish people was only an experience with soldiers, with settlers, and with that kind of treatment. But fast forward to a bit in my early 20s, I was traveling. I think this may have been during the period of the Second Intifada. I was in Europe and in the UK specifically, and I came across a pro-Palestinian protest. And in that protest, I met a Jewish person who I got to speaking to. He was an academic, and I realized that, I mean, now looking back, I didn't have the language to identify him as an anti-Zionist, but that was my first experience of meeting a Jewish person who wasn't a soldier or an occupation, part of the occupation, or a settler or anything. And that was, I would say, my tipping point, my switch of when I started learning and unlearning and expanding my community to include Jewish friends and allies in this fight for collective liberation and justice. So I wanted to share that today. And I have to say that I was a little hesitant about sharing that because I'm not going, as a Palestinian Muslim, I'm not going to take up the space of what my relationship to Judaism is. But given that the IHRA really conflates Zionism with Judaism, I thought it might be a good idea to share. So thank you for listening and your patience. And now I kind of want to move to framing the moment of October 7th and beyond. And we all know nothing started on October 7th. It was just a turning point in public discourse, and even an escalation of violence, aggression, genocide, and repression of voices and free speech. And the IHRA Handbook is now emerging as part of that discourse in this heightened context of silencing, surveillance, and erasure. I'm not going to speak to what the IHRA Handbook is, but I do want to speak to why Palestinians should be concerned. The IHRA has a very chilling effect on Palestinian speech. And all our narratives as Palestinians, the Nakba, apartheid, genocide, settler colonialism, they're all at risk of being labeled anti-Semitic. Anti-Palestinian racism is at an all-time high globally, and anyone who's plugged in outside of mainstream media and conversation knows this. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association defines it or highlights IHRA as a form of APR by silencing, excluding, and dehumanizing Palestinians. And then, of course, as Corey also mentioned, the criminalization of dissent. This encourages law enforcement and institutions overall to surveil, punish, and silence Palestinian advocacy. We see this playing out even in the bubble bylaws that are taking hold in different Canadian cities, as well as the clampdown on encampments and free speech and doxing that we see. So IHRA really does create that chilling environment where calls for Palestinian rights are seen as discriminatory. So for those of you who don't, or maybe aren't as familiar with APR as others, and are always that question of why APR? Why is APR a thing? Isn't it Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism? But no, APR is very specific. It is adjacent to both of those types of racism, but it really does work on first of all, it doesn't only affect Palestinians, it affects their allies as well. And it really silences, excludes, erases stereotypes, and dehumanizes Palestinians and their narratives. It justifies violence against Palestinians, it defames Palestinians and their allies, and it excludes Palestinians' perspectives from all the conversations and narratives happening. And as opposed to Islamophobia, where in Islamophobia, the discourse or the goal is to magnify the threat of Muslims, to instill that fear. In anti-Palestinian racism, it really is diminishing that existence of Palestinians as part of that, and also framing it as a religious struggle when it is a settler occupation situation is very problematic. Some of the top forms of defamation against Palestinians and their allies are criticizing Israel, being anti-Israel, being anti-Zionist, and supporting BDS as well as one of those. And you can see by these examples here that IHRA really has created a space for conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Other prominent manifestations of anti-Palestinian racism is erasing or excluding Palestinians and their narratives, slandering Palestinians and their allies as anti-Semitic, defaming them generally, denying Palestinian indigeneity to Palestine, and denying the Nakba. Many pro-Israel groups and all establishments, as we've seen significantly in the past 20 months, seem intent on preventing any discussion or any engagement of Palestine or Palestinian, and even dismissing it as being too problematic, or we don't want to, it's too complicated. But that in itself is a form of racism. Now, we get a lot of questions or statements of, oh, you brought all these politics, these global politics to Canada. We don't want these issues here. But the fact of the matter is they are still very much happening and escalating more and more as the genocide intensifies and people are speaking up more, and there is a push to end this genocide, for ceasefire, for letting aids in, for an arms embargo. All that is creating even more racism and trying attempts to silence. So I'm going to go through some examples of things that have actually happened, and these are all recent. And what I want you to remember is they aren't isolated incidents and we're magnifying them for the sake of drama. These happen every day. I mean, I've been giving some of these examples for months now, and I keep updating them because of so many different incidents that happen almost on a daily basis, if not more. So this is a video that I'm not going to play because I am concerned about the time, but this is an example of a high school in Ontario where a young man was wearing his kufiya, And his guidance counselor told him he looked like a terrorist. And when he went to the office to complain, she said, "Oh, I didn't say you look like a terrorist. I said you remind me of a terrorist." So even wearing a kufiya is considered risky now. I mean, I always share the examples. I've lived here on Turtle Island for 17 years now, and every winter I use my kufi as my scarf. And the past 2 winters, I've been worried about how that's going to be perceived, and me trying to shrink myself because of fear, or that's not me, and it's not where we should be as a community. Some of the examples that we've had and we've witnessed, and this isn't unique to the past 20 months since this phase of the genocide happened, but doxing people. I mean, many of us are familiar with the websites that have academics, students, professionals, doctors, lawyers, all listed there as being anti-Israel and anti-Semitic in attempts to dox them and prevent them from any future opportunities. The Human Rights Commissioner in Canada was hired, but then there was a very strong pro-Israel campaign or pro-Zionist campaign to get him removed, and he was forced to resign because of years ago posts that he made that were pro-Palestinian. Also, hate speech, instigators at peaceful protests, police brutality. I will the next slide, just so that I give a little trigger warning, as there is a bit of blood, but there's nothing overly graphic. But I do want to share an example of some of the police brutality that happened at a peaceful demonstration that was only escalated because police kettled the protesters, and there was a violent crackdown for no apparent reason. And this one is very personal to me because this young man here is my son. So some of the key points that I do want to highlight from IJV's commentary, and I also want to highlight that IJV, JVP, Just Say No to Genocide, if not now, there are so many organizations recently, but also have been working for many years to prove that ally is a verb, not a noun. And we are grateful, we as Palestinians are grateful for that solidarity and the legitimizing sometimes of our concerns and our issues, and helping amplify our voices. Even me being here today is part of that, centering the Palestinian narrative, and that is something I appreciate. So the commentary was really good. I look at these and think, oh, I wish I had said that. I wish I had done that. That is so true. The key points: the misrepresentation of Jewish identity, that claiming that all Jews are indigenous to Israel is an erasure of Jewish diversity and a tool for Zionist justification. And it dismisses anti-Zionist Jews as being tokenized or fringe, and this delegitimizes the Palestinian Jewish solidarity. Rewriting anti-Semitism, focusing on pro-Palestinian speech instead of real threats, and far white supremacy. Corey mentioned, absolutely, there is a growth in anti-Semitism, but this isn't it. Pro-Palestinian speech isn't anti-Semitic. That failure to distinguish between the criticism of Israel and the hatred of Jews absolutely isn't it is problematic. And suppression of practices in education, curriculums, in law, encouraging law enforcement to just treat anti-Zionism as hate speech, in civil society, like defunding organizations, firing workers, and criminalizing protests. All of that are problematic in IHRA. So some of the realities of Palestinians that are under attack is that the core message of Palestinian resistance, like speaking of our dispossession and ongoing genocide, that's being erased. We aren't allowed to say the word genocide without being challenged or doxxed or fired, and denying the Nakba under IHRA is considered protected speech, and naming apartheid is a hate crime, when in fact these are actual factual events and systems that are still happening today. international organizations such as Genocide Watch, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and ICJ rulings all affirm Israel's human rights violations. The handbook forbids naming them. This is all very problematic, and we as a society should really be actively pushing against this. The handbook protects Israel's image at the cost of Palestinian lives and truth. So, reclaiming the conversation, what do we do? What are the next steps? First of all, rejecting IHRA is not anti-Semitic. It's necessary for justice. And speaking of justice, we really need to reiterate that the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight for Palestinian freedom and justice are not in any way mutually exclusive. They can be and should be fought together because we're all working against the same fight, far white colonial powers that white supremacy powers that need to be pushed back against. I love this quote, anti-Semitism must be fought, but IHRA is not the way. So some of the calls to action is, in addition, like what Corey said, engage people, bring this commentary to the attention of your EDI departments, your unions, your employer, your school boards. Really defend Palestinian rights as part of a broader anti-racist, anti-colonial struggle. And I think that's it from my end. But here are some additional resources if you'd like to learn more. And as Sarah said, if we're happy to take questions by email after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dalia. So appreciate you being with us here tonight, sharing and both from your enormous professional expertise and also those personal elements that you bring to this discussion are so appreciated. So thank you again. Yeah. And now I am delighted to introduce Joshua Seeley Harrington. Joshua is an associate professor and the chair of equality law at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Before joining Windsor Law, Joshua was a law clerk at the Federal Court and Supreme Court of Canada, as well as an assistant professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law, where he was awarded Professor of the Year by the student body and Person of the Year by the Faculty Association for his steadfast defense of academic and Palestinian freedom. Joshua's teaching, research, and advocacy apply critical legal theory to questions of socio-legal identity and justice, with a particular focus on Black and Palestinian solidarity and resistance. Thank you, Joshua.
I'm really happy to join this panel and to provide additional racial justice critique of the IHRA definition and Canada's so-called Antisemitism handbook. The shameful silence of so many racial justice academics during an unprecedented and systematic campaign of weaponized anti-Semitism allegations is an abhorrent abdication of our responsibility as scholars, and it is my hope to try and help to fill that gap with my own work. It is precisely in the midst of such racist reprisal that academics of racial justice should be using their expertise to explain to the public how anti-Semitism is being cynically weaponized to advance Western imperial interests, and I sincerely appreciate IJV's invitation to articulate such an explanation here today. As a roadmap for my remarks, I will outline 4 distinct objections to the IHRA definition, which each individually demonstrate its illegitimacy as a conceptual framework for understanding anti-Semitism, namely context, authority, coherence, and racial justice. My first objection is the context in which the handbook was published. Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. This was found plausible by the International Court of Justice and was found proven by what is essentially a consensus of leading genocide scholars and human rights organizations. Israel also practices apartheid. Again, this is essentially a consensus amongst leading scholars and human rights organizations. Moreover, the International Court of Justice concluded that Israel practices either racial segregation or apartheid, both particularly severe forms of racial discrimination. During a year where international legal consensus finally caught up to the Palestinian reality of Israeli oppression, Canada's official response to Israel's criminal genocide and apartheid fell further behind. Canada could have simply made innocuous commitments to begrudgingly comply with domestic and international law. Instead, it published a government handbook that labels the mere naming of Israel's overt criminality not just inaccurate, but anti-Semitic. That is, it casts not just anti-Zionism, but international law, and in particular Palestinian human rights, as anti-Semitic. Indeed, under IHRA, even Israel's former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, would be called anti-Semitic for his recent characterization of Israel's siege on Gaza as a war of annihilation. Consequently, it is actually quite misleading to even call Canada's Anti-Semitism Handbook by that name. It is, upon review, an Israel Immunity Handbook and must be understood as such. Jewish writer M. Cohen puts it astutely, quote, "I can't express enough how absolutely absurd it is to earnestly engage with people who accuse the victims of genocide and the people who oppose that genocide of hating the perpetrators and supporters of that genocide," end quote. During an ongoing genocide in Palestine, I hope I don't need to elaborate on how using a so-called definition of racism to limit criticism of that genocide is itself profoundly racist. Yet that is precisely how the definition of anti-Semitism in the Israel Immunity Handbook functions. This context, that is, the obvious purpose of the handbook, which was to immunize a rogue state from international legal scrutiny, is itself disqualifying of the IHRA definition. My second objection is the IHRA definition's complete lack of credible authority. As an initial point, Canada defines anti-Semitism using the very same definition used by Donald Trump, an ardent anti-Semite, and Benjamin Netanyahu, a wanted war criminal. These are not simply strange bedfellows for a country that purports to respect the rule of law and racial justice. These are racist and criminal bedfellows. In any event, the IHRA definition is widely discredited. The Israel Immunity Handbook describes the IHRA definition as, quote, "the most authoritative, comprehensive, and representative definition of anti-Semitism in the world today." This is nonsense, both concerning the IHRA definition itself, but especially with respect to its so-called illustrative examples. First, consider the IHRA definition. The only authority cited in the handbook is an op-ed in the avowedly Zionist National Post and 2 submissions seeking IHRA approval at the UN, both of which were ultimately unsuccessful. In contrast, what does actual research about the IHRA reveal? More than 100 Israeli and international civil society organizations asked the United Nations to reject the controversial IHRA definition because it is being misused to protect Israel from legitimate criticism. 122 Palestinian and Arab academics, journalists, and intellectuals rejected the IHRA because the suppression of Palestinian rights in the IHRA definition betrays an attitude upholding Jewish privilege in Palestine instead of Jewish rights, and Jewish supremacy over Palestinians instead of Jewish safety. 128 scholars specializing in anti-Semitism, Holocaust studies, modern Jewish history, and related fields, who wrote to the United Nations in 2022, urging it to reject the IHRA definition because of politically motivated efforts to instrumentalize the fight against anti-Semitism at and against the United Nations. 350 leading scholars of anti-Semitism, Holocaust studies, and related fields who endorsed an alternate definition, the Jerusalem Declaration, and did so expressly because the IHRA definition is unclear in key respects and widely open to different interpretations, which has caused confusion and generated controversy, hence weakening the fight against anti-Semitism. Even the lead drafter of the IHRA definition, Kenneth Stern, concedes that the definition has been weaponized by right-wing Jewish groups in an attack on academic freedom and free speech. A common response to anti-IHRA advocacy is that Jews, like all racial minorities, should get to define their own oppression. Indeed, the Israel Immunity Handbook relies on this same retort. But as the above figures demonstrate, many Jews dispute that the IHRA is indeed the correct definition of anti-Semitism. This definition is not considered authoritative by any credible authorities and is even rejected by most Jewish scholars with actual expertise on anti-Semitism and related fields. Second, consider the IHRA's so-called illustrative examples, which, by the way, occupy over 1/3 of Canada's Israel Immunity Handbook, 20 pages of the 58-page document. The handbook justifies its authority on the basis of the supposedly democratic process that created it. That process was rather heavily lobbied for by pro-Israel interests. But even if that process had been perfectly democratic, An outrageous omission in the handbook is that the member countries of the IHRA decision-making body were only able to reach a consensus on adopting the definition by excluding the examples. Consequently, even on the handbook's own illogic, a third of its contents are rather non-authoritative. This overwhelming scholarly and political opposition to the IHRA definition no doubt informs the express rejection of the IHRA by the Canadian Association of University Teachers and the 72,000 academic staff it represents, the express rejection of the IHRA by the American Association of University Professors and the 45,000 members it represents, and the express rejection of the IHRA by myriad faculty associations, including U of T, York, Osgoode Hall, TMU, OCAD, Queen's, Ottawa, Western, Regina, Laurier, Concordia, Mount Royal, Mount St. Vincent, the University of Quebec at Montreal, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and many, many others. None of this near universal criticism, by the way, is even mentioned in the government's handbook. The handbook is thus not simply an unserious piece of research and writing, it is overtly deceptive. In particular, its claim that the illustrative examples in the IHRA definition have some sort of authority, when, to the contrary, on the handbook's own articulation, these examples lack any authority, is an egregious misrepresentation in any context, but especially in an official government document. The IHRA's abject lack of authority is a second independent reason to reject it as a credible framework for understanding anti-Semitism. My third objection to the IHRA definition is its blatant incoherence. As a matter of logic, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is unacceptable because it hardly defines anything. It describes anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews. As M. Cohen writes, quote, "The definition itself is comically vague. The statement, Jews make good food, technically meets it. No coherent understanding of racism can make mere perception of a group racist in itself. Recall, this so-called definition is the only thing that the IHRA member states agreed to. They specifically could not reach a consensus on the so-called illustrative examples. So this is what we are left with, certain perceptions as somehow inherently anti-Semitic. However, the incoherence of the Israel Immunity Handbook is not limited to this indeterminate definition. As you proceed through the handbook's elaboration, additional layers of incoherence emerge, because what the handbook calls anti-Semitic routinely fails to involve certain perceptions of Jews, such that the handbook does not elaborate on the definition, but rather contradicts it. For example, the handbook says targeting Israel might be anti-Semitic. If the handbook were a genuine resource, it would explain when such targeting is anti-Semitic, rather than simply referring to it in the abstract. More importantly, though, examples abound of when one would target Israel without harboring any certain perception of Jews, anti-Semitic or otherwise. Consider B'Tselem, the Israeli nonprofit that concluded Israel practices racial apartheid in 2021. It is a nonprofit based in Israel that documents Israel's human rights abuses. Its mandate thus targets Israel. This mandate, though, in no way reflects any certain perception of Jews. Are we genuinely to believe that the bare concept of state accountability inside Israel is by definition anti-Semitic? As a second example, the handbook claims that criticism of Israel that is different, for example, in terms of its nature, magnitude, severity, or suggested remedy, than that leveled against any other country, is presumptively anti-Semitic because it is discriminatory. Parenthetically, discrimination under equality principles relates to protected grounds, not nation states, so this analysis is already confused, both politically and normatively. Regardless, examples abound of when one would criticize Israel differently without harboring any certain perception of Jews. Consider magnitude and severity. What if country Y killed 500 of Israel's civilians and Israel retaliated by killing 200,000 of country Y's civilians? If I criticize Israel more than I criticize country Y because Israel killed 400 times as many civilians, then the magnitude and severity of my criticism indeed differs. But to call this presumptively anti-Semitic is ridiculous. The magnitude and severity simply corresponds to the country's respective levels of criminality. This same incoherence continues in the so-called illustrative examples. A whopping 7 of the 11 examples expressly concern Israel. Yet one can easily criticize Israel and not have any certain perception of Jews. Indeed, we have witnessed legions of Jews criticizing Israel for its egregious criminality over the past 2 years, and of course, for decades before that. If any state commits apartheid and genocide, one almost certainly criticizes the state because they oppose war crimes, not because they have any particular perception of the state's majority identity. Consequently, the IHRA's incoherence is a third independent basis for disqualifying it as a credible framework for understanding anti-Semitism. Lastly, a racial justice lens likewise disqualifies the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Indeed, various luminaries of racial thought, from Angela Davis to James Baldwin, were ardent critics of Israel and Zionism. Characterizing Palestinian human rights as anti-Semitic is, of course, racist against Palestinians, as Dahlia explained, but the Israel Immunity Handbook is also anti-Semitic, as Corey and the IJV commentary explain. The handbook stereotypes all Jews as Zionist and pro-Israel, despite 49% of Canadian Jews not identifying as Zionists. Jewish luminary Judith Butler calls such stereotyping clearly anti-Semitic. And the handbook is also anti-Semitic because it mischaracterizes anti-Semitism, thus making it harder to identify and challenge. In conclusion, IJV's commentary is a welcome corrective to Canada's perverse and racist construction of anti-Semitism, but they need the support of other racial justice academics, scholars, and organizations whose silence, I hope, abates as Israel's rank criminality threatens not only Palestinian existence, but world peace. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Joshua, for giving us such clear pillars on which to hinge and defend our criticism of the Israel Immunity Handbook. I will be taking context, authority, coherence, and racial justice away to think through tonight. Thank you again. I'm going to hand it right over to Amaya Gelman as our last speaker tonight. Amaya is the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which examines Zionism as a power structure. Her academic research is on the history of ideas about race, queerness, and rights. Her teaching has spanned NYU, Sarah Lawrence College, freedom schools, and encampments. Her book on the Anti-Defamation League is due out later this year. Amaya.
Hi, and thank you so much. In 1 second, I'm going to share my screen with some slides. Before I do that, I just want to send solidarity to the people of Palestine and Iran who are under the bombs of Zionist expansion, backed by the United States and also lots of other powerful nations. And I also just want to extend my thanks from the perspective of a US academic to IJV for your sort of prescient and early leadership in fighting the IHRA definition. I'm going to share my slides now, I hope. Let's see. I'm gonna leave it like that, even though it's not exactly how it's supposed to be, so that I can see my notes. So I'm gonna give the US context, and also I hope a little bit of capacity to resist from the US context. So the US has been a very particular site. So since the IHRA definition launched in 2016, that was the same year and moment that we started with the Trump era and the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, the White Nationalist March, kind of created a platform for Zionist advocates who presented themselves as anti-Semitism organizations to take center stage. And that was a really powerful conjunction with the launch of the IHRA definition in the US context. But in the last couple of years, I'm talking about since the genocide began, but also in the years before that, a few years before that, we've seen the IHRA definition and its sort of the mindset that it invites and permits, and the sort of framings that it invites and permits, become part of a very concrete system to co-opt the idea of civil rights in order to shore up repressive state power. And I'm sure there are many ways to sort of slice and dice this, but we have been talking for the last 2 years about a couple of very specific pieces of it that I want to just sort of offer as ways to think about this. So we have a system that is funded by the rise of mega donors. So the vast increase in economic inequality and corporate oligarchy, and then sort of the expansion of capitalism has produced this mega donor class, which is tied to right-wing politics, and it is funding and sort of supercharging this system of smaller, sometimes NGOs and sometimes just little organizations that are not even really formally organized, that do a couple of things. One is they produce narrative. They produce a narrative through actually advertising, which is one. We don't necessarily think about politics in terms of advertising, but there are a few advertising campaigns that have really entered into politics in the United States. One is the Blue Square campaign, which is funded by megadonor Robert Kraft, and the other is the Jew Belong campaign, which is funded by the slightly lesser megadonor Archie Gottesman. And they're not the only two, but they're significant ones, and they have sort of instructed Jews in the United States to be afraid. They've taken data that is totally manipulated and taken out of context. The Blue Square campaign, for example, suggests in passing that Jews are more than half of the targets of hate crimes in the United States. In fact, it's religious hate crimes, and it does say that on the ad, but religious hate crimes are actually 14% of the total, and Jews are a smaller percentage of that. And in fact, hate crimes are much far more prevalent against people of color, and that doesn't even count police violence. So, for example, we're told to be afraid, and then we're told using a series, sort of the language that's in that advertising, that the culprit is Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and their supporters, including anti-Zionist Jews, and that it sort of conflates the idea of violence with the idea of anti-Semitism being criticism of Israel. And then these advertisements and this narrative produces complaint, right? We have a mechanism also of complaint. The Anti-Defamation League invites people to file complaints about anti-Semitic incidents. They encourage people to file those complaints with their university offices of DEI. They encourage them to file Title VI civil rights complaints. Title VI is the mechanism through which primarily minorities, people of color, queers are supposed to be able to protect their rights on college campuses. And these complaints become a body of knowledge themselves, suggesting that all Jews think that anti-Zionist and anti-genocide activity is anti-Semitic and targeted at them and making them unsafe. And then these complaints fuel lawfare. How do I do the second slide? The lawfare is a new sector, a relatively new sector made up of organizations that both bring lawsuits themselves and also engage white shoe law firms to do this work. And they produce an enormous body of lawsuits, but also rarely adjudications. More what they produce is settlements. Universities and employers and others are much more inclined to settle. And so the allegations made in the lawsuits that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism become part of the fabric of our lives. And the last piece of that is, as these institutions have done that, risk management comes into the frame. So we have a sort of capital market that's telling universities and largely universities are the target of this, and other employers, if you don't adopt the IHRA definition, essentially, and if you don't enforce it, then you're creating a fiscal risk that devalues your business. So we have this sort of system that is it works together. The pieces of it work together, and it implements the IHRA definition and the sort of affective and sort of fear-based pieces of it, regardless of whether it's been adopted. So I think that's a really important way to understand what's happening with the IHRA definition. It's not only about adoption, it's also about how it's being moved into public culture. Where we are right now in the US, obviously it's a shifting time. We are in a moment where after the past year and a half of protests on campuses and arrests, that our movements are sort of winding through disciplinary processes, and they are also characterized by this new era of fear of deportation and distraction by U.S. collapse and the globalization of the Israeli militarist machine, and also by the use of the fascist Trump administration of the pretense of caring about anti-Semitism and the centering of Christian Zionism. This has created a slightly new context for us in which there actually is an opening to fight the IHRA definition because it is so clearly understood as a tool of fascism, although we're not quite there yet. The other thing that I want to note is that the IHRA definition has empowered a new set of right-wing, like very explicitly right-wing organizations who are making the same claims about anti-Semitism and the idea that they're protecting against anti-Semitism as organizations who in the past have had to identify themselves as kind of progressive or liberal and civil rights organizations. So, for example, we've had the rise of organizations like Betar and Canary Mission and Mothers Against College Antisemitism, who do not purport at all to be civil rights organizations, but instead are using this sort of machinery of fear about appearing to be anti-Semitic by allowing anti-Zionist and anti-genocide speech. We've gotten to the point where Betar and Canary Mission both have been making lists of people who they think should be deported. Of course, they're targeting Palestinian and Arab people and people of color primarily. They've also made lists of Jews who they think the Israeli government should not allow into the state of Israel. And there is some evidence that their rightward motion is causing dissension within Zionist organizations that have kind of sold themselves as civil rights organizations, but it's not particularly strong. And what's happening in the course of this work is that that institutions like universities are increasingly adopting that right-wing policy as if it were civil rights policy. And the example that I have here is that NYU last fall adopted a policy that basically said that saying the word Zionist in a mean way was tantamount to discrimination or hate speech. This has also empowered the most overtly right-wing organizations to become part of a kind of sanitized infrastructure of training and policy making. So the one I want to just highlight is the Combat Antisemitism movement, which is an anti-woke organization. It's like literally like a anti-critical race theory, like the housing subsidies or communism kind of thing. And they have been providing trainings for mayors in the United States. And here recently, Jewish Currents found that they had been providing training for the New York City Police Department that categorized the keffiyeh and the watermelon as anti-Semitic symbols. And even though that's not explicitly part of the IHRA definition, the IHRA definition doesn't mention watermelons because it was written in 2016. This is the kind of movement of IHRA-focused organizations into public policy that we're seeing. I wanted just to offer a resource. I can't remember who mentioned it. Maybe Corey and maybe Joshua both mentioned that the Foundation for Middle East Peace has been tracking where this legislation is moving in law. I will just say that the sort of big picture is that the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is the US federal version of this legislation, has failed over and over. They cannot get it passed because it's a terrible bill. But what's happened instead is that there has been a lot of state movement, efforts to pass state legislation. Also, some of it has been defeated, but some of it has not. And that legislation does two things. It tries to push the IHRA definition into law, but it also tries to attach it to hate crimes legislation, similar to what's happening in Canada. And that hate crimes legislation becomes the basis for policing, for police violence, for firing people, for criminalizing Palestine solidarity, including Jewish Palestine solidarity. Let's see. I want to make sure that I don't overstep the time. I think it's really important to recognize how much pushback has developed, and this is, I think, a theme that Dalia was mentioning also, that there is such strong resistance now that we expect the pushback on the resistance to escalate. Right? It's a back and forth between the resistance and the repression. Particularly, universities have been a focus for this battle, because the IHRA definition has failed so much at the federal level, and because it's so easy and accessible for Zionist organizations to simply work on the president of a university or the trustees of a university to get them to implement policy, and in that way sort of spread and normalize policy that they have not been able to implement through other forms of law. Because of this level of resistance, the Anti-Defamation League and its partner, the Academic Engagement Network, which you should also look out for, has, of course, now started targeting academic and professional associations with more like, oh, here's how you can not be anti-Semitic, and here's how you can defend against the risk that may be posed if you appear anti-Semitic. So that's just a sort of framing of how the pushback goes. I want to offer just a little bit of resource. So it's kind of in parallel to the IJV's resource list. The Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism has tried to produce some resources. All this is really is just language from successful resolutions against the IHRA definition. We've pulled out the parts that worked, tried to help break down the arguments that have been successful so that they can be kind of used and adapted for the spaces where people are trying to fight this work. What's new here is that in the last week, that there's more pushback on the idea that IHRA is anti-Semitic. Here are two amicus briefs. One was filed by a group of independent scholars, or independently by a group of 27 Jewish studies scholars, and the other by Jewish Voice for Peace. You can save this slide if you like, but it lists out all of the things that we've been saying to ourselves, like IHRA is anti-Semitic because it redefines Jewishness. IHRA is anti-Semitic because it ignores the fact that Zionist organizations are political, right? And now it's beginning to enter into law. So there are two amicus briefs that were filed in the case that Harvard is bringing against the federal government for withdrawing lots and lots of funding for it, claiming that it was anti-Semitic. And the last thing I want to offer is that there is also a new, rather than trying to define anti-Semitism, a new offering in the NYU Press Keywords Now essays, which is written by scholars from Jewish Voice for Peace. I contributed to this also, that gives the history of anti-Semitism as an idea and a concept, and places IHRA in the context of history and politics rather than, as Joshua said, sort of abstracting it into the ether. So I hope these can be some useful tools, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing from Canada because we need it. We need it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our incredible speakers, to Corey, to Dalia, to Joshua and Amaya, and to everyone who joined us tonight. Before you leave the Zoom, please take a moment to use the link in the chat and download Silenced in Our Name. All of our speakers left us with really important ways to take this into our day-to-day work and lives to make sure that IHRA is not adopted in our unions, in our places of work, our school boards, our universities. Silenced in Our Name is one tool to ground our understanding of how the Canadian IHRA Handbook threatens freedom of expression and promotes anti-Palestinian racism. If you have any questions after this meeting, or if you know about IHRA being pushed in your community, you can get in touch by sending an email to info@ijvcanada.org. Thank you all again for being here with us tonight.